I've seen livestock scatter before. Coyotes, storms. Sometimes a careless ranch hand leaves the gate unlatched, and you spend half the morning chasing animals across the hills. But this was different. When I walked out that morning, the air still damp with dew, I expected the usual bleating, the restless shuffle of hooves waiting for feed. Instead, there was silence. Too much silence. The kind that presses against your ears until you realize what's wrong. The pen was empty. At first I thought maybe they'd broken through the fencing. I've patched enough splintered boards in my life to know the signs of a restless herd. But the boards weren't broken. They were sliced, each plank cut clean through as though by some kind of mechanical blade. No animal does that, and no ordinary thief either. I knelt down, my knees pressing into the cold earth, and that's when I saw them. Marks unlike anything I'd seen before. Perfect circles pressed deep into the soil, evenly spaced as though a machine had walked through my pasture. The strange part wasn't just their shape. It was the heat. When I laid my palm against one of the impressions, the earth was still warm, like metal had kissed it only moments ago. Whoever had done this hadn't been gone long. I've lived on this land all my life. I know the trails, the neighbors, the way rustlers usually work. They take what they can move quickly, leave a mess of tracks, and drive the animals toward known escape routes. But these tracks, they didn't follow any trail I knew. They cut through rough country, straight across gullies and rock beds, a path only someone with careful planning, or unfamiliar machinery, could manage. I saddled my horse with hands that trembled, not from fear but from the realization that I was staring at something bigger than theft. Whoever had done this wasn't desperate. They were organized, and they had knowledge of my land that no outsider should have had. The first mile of following the trail was nothing but unease pressing against my ribs. My horse snorted nervously at the strange markings, reluctant to step too close. The deeper I rode into the hills, the more the evidence piled up. Clean cuts through brush, small shards of metal lodged into tree bark as if something sharp had passed too quickly. Whatever had taken my herd wasn't improvising. It was executing a plan. I told myself to turn back, to ride into town, find the sheriff, and report what I'd seen. That's what any sane rancher would do. But sanity doesn't mean much when it's your land, your animals, your livelihood stripped from under your nose. No, I had to see where this led. An hour into the trail, I spotted smoke. A thin column rising from the old canyon, a place no honest man had reason to set foot in. The closer I rode, the stronger the smell of livestock and sweat became. But there was something else, too. The faint scent of tobacco, the bitter tang of boiled coffee. Men. I left my horse tethered in the brush and climbed the ridge on foot. The canyon below opened into a natural hollow, hidden from the main trails. There, against the grey light of morning, I saw them. My animals, penned in with rough rope and stakes. And around a fire, for men. My chest tightened when I recognized one of them. Broad shoulders, familiar stance. I'd eaten with him at my own table, ridden beside him searching for lost calves not a month ago. Ezekiel Marsh. A man I'd called neighbor. Even from where I crouched, I could see the notebook in his hands, the way he flipped through it as though inventorying cargo, not living creatures. He pointed toward my ranch as the others laughed. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. Next shipment, schedule, buyers. My goats weren't the goal. They were practice. I should have left then, but curiosity, or maybe rage, anchored me. I stayed long enough to see more riders arriving, men I'd known for years. Curtis Valentine, a rancher 3 miles east. Others I couldn't name at that distance, but the way they greeted each other told me this wasn't their first meeting. The sight twisted my stomach. Neighbors who'd spoken of protecting one another, men who'd shaken my hand in trust, were now conspiring to strip me clean. And worse, the operation was too polished, too coordinated to be just them. There was backing here. Someone higher, someone powerful. I was still reeling when the sound of hoofbeats drifted from behind me. More riders, approaching the canyon from the far trail. My heart sank when I recognized the lead figure. Gray horse, black hat. Sheriff Morrison. The man entrusted with keeping the law, now riding into camp like he belonged there. I pressed my back into the rock, bile rising in my throat. The sheriff didn't break in or sneak. He dismounted, pulled out a key, and let himself into my house. When he emerged, he carried papers, my papers, schedules, herd counts, details only someone with inside access could know. And he rode straight to the camp. The law wasn't going to save me. The law was working against me. That was the moment I understood the truth. My missing herd wasn't an isolated theft. It was the doorway into something much larger, darker. A conspiracy woven through my neighbors, my friends, the very authorities I'd trusted. And I, standing there with the dirt of my ranch still on my boots, had stumbled into the middle of it. I thought the betrayal would break me. Instead, it sharpened me. Because if they thought I'd roll over quietly while they carved up everything I owned, they'd forgotten one thing. This was my land, and I wasn't done fighting for it. The town of Dry Creek had always been small, but winter made it feel even smaller. The streets were narrow veins of frozen mud, and the wind seemed to whistle warnings through every crack in the wooden buildings. Life here was measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the sound of boots crunching on frost and the occasional crack of gunfire echoing across the plains. And now, with the stranger's arrival, the air carried something heavier than the cold: suspicion. The man had no name to give, or at least, not one he was willing to share. Folks at the saloon simply called him the Drifter. He carried himself with the quiet weight of someone who had seen too much but refused to speak of it. His hat was pulled low, and his coat bore the dust of long roads. Yet despite the worn fabric, his eyes were sharp, searching, always searching. Some said he was a fugitive, others whispered he was a gunslinger hired by enemies unseen. Whatever the truth, he had chosen Dry Creek as his resting place, and that alone was enough to set tongues wagging. It wasn't just idle gossip either. The frontier was a land where silence could kill, and secrets were a form of currency. Every man, woman, and child knew that a stranger's presence meant the balance of the town could shift overnight. And it did. At the edge of town, in a cabin smaller than most barns, lived the Drifter's aging mother. She had followed her son across too many roads to count, her wrinkled hands still strong enough to stir a pot of beans or patch a torn sleeve. Her body had grown frail, but her spirit was fierce. To her, every hardship was nothing more than another trial sent by God, or so she claimed. In truth, she feared the world less than she feared what her son carried inside him. She had seen the way his fingers lingered near his revolver even in sleep, the way his shoulders stiffened at the sound of a horse approaching. A man did not become that way unless he was being hunted, or unless he was doing the hunting himself. And then there was her, the Apache woman. She stood at the edges of Dry Creek like a storm waiting for its moment to break. Her presence was both a defiance and a promise. The settlers watched her with suspicion, their eyes filled with the old hatred that had soaked the frontier in blood for decades. Yet she did not bow her head. Her dark hair fell like a banner across her shoulders, and her gaze was sharp enough to make even hardened men look away. Her appearance was no accident. Whispers travelled fast, and before long, everyone knew she had approached the Drifter with an offer, her daughter's hand in marriage. To some, it was a strange proposal. To others, it was dangerous. Alliances between settlers and Apache were almost unheard of, and when they happened, they brought more trouble than peace. But for reasons no one understood, the drifter did not refuse outright. It was this tension that turned Dry Creek into a boiling pot. At the saloon, men argued in hushed tones. Some believed the drifter's acceptance could bring a fragile peace with the Apache, an end to raids and bloodshed. Others muttered that it was a betrayal, that marrying into the Apache would make the drifter no better than the enemy. In the church, prayers grew louder. In the sheriff's office, the gun rack grew heavier. The drifter himself remained silent on the matter. He worked odd jobs, hauled lumber, carried water, and kept to himself. Yet at night, when the fire burned low, his mother would ask him questions. "Why her?" she whispered one night, her voice trembling as much from age as from fear. He stared into the fire, the orange glow reflecting in his eyes. "Because she knows something the others don't." What does she know? That the past don't stay buried. Not here. Not anywhere. There it was again, the burden he carried but refused to name. Days passed, and the cold grew harsher. One morning, the townsfolk woke to find the body of a ranch hand near the river. His chest bore a wound not from a bullet but from a blade, carved with precision. Some swore it was Apache work. Others claimed it was too clean, too deliberate, not the kind of cut made in the heat of battle. Suspicion turned into anger, and all eyes returned to the drifter. But he said nothing. Only his mother, standing beside him with her trembling hand pointing toward the Apache woman, seemed to voice what no one else dared. "She's the key." Whether that meant salvation or ruin, none could yet tell. But the winter of 1882 had only just begun, and Dry Creek was already bleeding. The settlement of Redstone, once silent except for the wind and coyotes, had transformed overnight. Word had spread like wildfire. A drifter had returned from the Apache camps alive, and not only alive. He had been offered something unthinkable. Some whispered marriage, others said an alliance. But in every tavern corner and around every poker table, one fact remained: the balance of the frontier had shifted. For the man holding that knowledge, Ethan Cole, it was both a burden and a curse. He had come back with his mother's frail hand clutching his arm and with fruit still in his palm, a strange token from the Apache woman whose piercing gaze had haunted him since. Yet, nothing weighed heavier than the silence he carried inside. At night, the silence was broken by voices. His mother, though aged and trembling, still had fire in her voice when she scolded him. "You think this woman's words were a blessing?" she hissed as the wind rattled their shack's wooden frame. "It's a trap, a chain around your neck. The Apaches never give without taking twice as much in return." But Ethan's heart wasn't so certain. The image of the woman, tall, proud, and unafraid, lingered in his thoughts, more vivid than the dull stares of townsfolk or the cracked faces of barmaids. He had seen strength in her that Redstone lacked, a kind of fire that could not be bought with whiskey or won at cards. Still, he was not blind to danger. Redstone was already stirring, factions forming quietly like rattlesnakes coiling in tall grass. The sheriff, a tired man with a tin star barely hanging on his vest, had called Ethan to his office 2 nights after his return. "I'll say this plain," the sheriff muttered, leaning across the desk. "Men don't like change. And what you brought back, this talk of a deal, this woman, smells like change. Too much of it." He tapped the barrel of his revolver against the wood for emphasis. "Keep it quiet, Cole. For your sake, and for your mother's." But secrets never lasted long in towns like Redstone. By the week's end, whispers turned to accusations. Ethan overheard 2 ranchers spitting in the dirt, claiming he had sold his soul to the Apache. Someone else muttered about half-breed children, and how such a thing would be the end of decent folk. His fists clenched, but he said nothing. Instead, he listened. He listened and he waited, and in the waiting, he began to sense something else. Betrayal moving closer, like footsteps behind him in the dark. It began with small signs. His horse, usually tethered tight outside the barn, was found roaming free one morning. His mother swore she heard someone outside their window at night. And then came the letter, slipped under their door with no name, no signature. If you value your blood, leave Redstone. She belongs to the desert, not to you. Ethan burned the paper, but the ashes did little to quiet the storm inside him. Who had written it? A rancher? A drunk miner? Or someone with more power? Someone who wanted him gone not for love, but for politics? The truth came sooner than he expected. One evening, as he walked back from the well, he caught sight of lantern light flickering in the abandoned church at the edge of town. He approached silently, pressing his back against the rotting wood. Voices inside drifted out, sharp as knives. "He's dangerous," one man said. "No," another voice corrected. "He's useful. If we let him live, we'll see what the Apaches want. If we kill him now, they'll come for blood. And the woman?" A pause. Then, "She's the key. With her, we control both sides." Ethan froze, every muscle tight. The words slithered into his ears like venom. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about love or duty or fear. It was about power. Power that men in Redstone would kill for, and power the Apache would never surrender. He slipped away into the night, his heart pounding. By the time he reached home, his mother was already waiting at the table, her eyes sharp despite her years. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked quietly, as though she had known all along. "Yes," Ethan whispered. "And they won't stop." The old woman's hand trembled as she reached for his. "Then you must choose, Ethan. Stand with them, or against them. But know this, if you stand in the middle, you'll be crushed." Her words hung heavy in the silence, heavier even than the memory of the Apache woman's piercing gaze. For the first time, Ethan understood. His fate was no longer just his own. Outside, the desert wind howled, carrying with it the sound of drums far in the distance. Apache drums, deep and steady like a heartbeat. The frontier was stirring, and Redstone was about to drown in its echoes. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the bones of the land. Snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of rooftops, icicles dripping steadily in the weak morning sun. The settlement was quieter than it had ever been, as if the storm had silenced even the gossip of the wind. Only the creak of wooden beams and the far-off cry of a hawk disturbed the air. In the middle of this muted calm, the man rose from his bedroll with stiff shoulders. His hand went instinctively to the satchel at his side, feeling the weight of the fruits he had carried since yesterday. The Apache woman's words still clung to him like burrs. "My daughter is perfect for you." He had turned the phrase over 100 times in his mind, and no matter how he rolled it, it refused to sit easy. His mother, sitting by the hearth with her thin hands folded in her lap, noticed his distracted stare. "Don't let the words of others root too deep," she said quietly, her voice like the cracking of dry twigs. "A man's path is his own." But the man knew it wasn't that simple. Life in the frontier was never just about choice. It was about survival, about alliances, about debts owed and favors repaid. Helping that Apache woman yesterday had already bound him to something larger than himself. What unsettled him was not her gratitude, but the weight of the promise she seemed to tie around his neck without his consent. He stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The morning was sharp and clean. each breath visible in the frozen air. Across the settlement, he saw her, the Apache woman's daughter. She stood with a posture both defiant and graceful, her long dark hair catching the sunlight. Her gaze locked on him immediately, unflinching, as if she had been waiting. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The settlement around them was busy with life again, children running with wooden sticks, men repairing wagons, women carrying water. Yet the world seemed to narrow until there was only the space between him and her. Then she smiled. It wasn't the gentle smile of a stranger offering kindness. It was sharper, like the edge of a knife hidden in silk. The man shifted uneasily. His mother stepped out behind him, her frail figure silhouetted against the doorway. She followed his gaze and, with a bony finger, pointed toward the young woman. "There. That one. She is trouble," she muttered in their own tongue, low enough so only he could hear. But trouble had always been the heartbeat of the frontier. He knew that well. Later that day, he walked into town with his mother beside him, her pace slow but steady. The general store was half empty, shelves stripped bare from the storm's long hunger. He bartered a few pelts for flour and salt, keeping his tone even, though every eye in the room seemed to weigh him. Word of his encounter with the Apache woman had already spread. He could feel it in the way conversations hushed when he entered, the way people glanced but quickly looked away. It was outside the store that it happened. A tall man with a scar cutting through his beard stepped forward, blocking the path. "You've been keeping company with Apaches," he said flatly. "That doesn't sit right with folks here." The man felt his jaw tighten. "I helped someone in need. That's all." The scarred man spat into the snow. "That's never all. You best watch yourself. Lines are drawn in this land, and stepping across them can get you killed." His mother tugged at his sleeve gently, urging him to move on. He did, but the weight of the warning stayed heavy on his shoulders. That evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, he found himself again staring at the Apache woman's daughter. She was closer this time, standing near the edge of the settlement where the wooden fence met the wilderness. In her hands, she carried a woven basket filled with herbs and roots. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with something unspoken. She raised her chin slightly, as if daring him to cross the distance. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he took a step forward. The winter of 1882 was cruel, but that night was crueler still. The small frontier cabin creaked under the weight of silence. Inside, the old woman, his mother, sat by the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she threaded a worn needle. The flames painted her face in shades of amber and shadow, highlighting the years of resilience etched into her skin. The man, let's call him simply the drifter, paced the wooden floor. His boots echoed with impatience, his fists clenching and unclenching as though he were holding invisible burdens. And then there was the Apache woman. She stood by the door, her eyes sharp as obsidian, her presence commanding the space even without a word. She had come earlier that day with a message. "My daughter is perfect for you." Her voice had been firm, almost ceremonial. But the offer had not been simple, nor romantic. It was a negotiation born of survival, trust, and something deeper neither of them dared to name. The drifter's mind replayed the encounter from the canyon. How she had bled, how he had carried her, how the snow had nearly swallowed them whole. That moment had bound them, but this new conversation was twisting that bond into something he didn't yet understand. His mother was the first to break the silence. "You cannot live in two worlds, boy," she said softly, though her words struck like iron. "A man must choose where his soul belongs. The land, the blood, or the future." The Apache woman's gaze flicked toward the fire, then back to him. "She is not just my daughter," she said. She is the last thread of a story that began long before you. If she joins with you, it is not marriage, it is a bridge. The drifter rubbed his temples, torn between duty and desire. And if I refuse? He asked. The woman's eyes narrowed. Then the canyon will remember you. And so will I. For a long time, the room said nothing. The only sound was the snapping of the firewood, like bones breaking under weight. Finally, the drifter's mother leaned forward, her old hands resting on her knees. Son, I raised you with hunger at the table and storms at the door. Don't think you can escape the storm now. Whether you walk into it or not, it will find you. This woman, she pointed with her needle toward the Apache, she brings more than a daughter. She brings history, vengeance, and hope tangled together. Are you ready to carry that? The drifter looked at them both, then at the frost-covered window. Outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit. Inside, his chest tightened. He had once dreamed of leaving Texas altogether, finding fortune in California or Mexico, somewhere the past couldn't claw at him. But now, the past stood in his cabin, demanding an answer. Suddenly, the Apache woman stepped closer, her voice dropping low. There are men riding this way. Hunters. They seek you, but they seek me more. If you want to know where your choice leads, you will have it tonight. The drifter froze. Hunters? From the fort. She shook her head. Worse. Not soldiers. Outlaws. The kind who kill not for coin, but for cruelty. His mother's lips thinned into a hard line. Then you best stop pacing and start loading your gun. The drifter grabbed his rifle from the corner, the metal cold in his hands. His heart pounded, not just with fear, but with something sharper, purpose. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt alive. The Apache woman moved to the window, her profile lit by moonlight seeping through the frost. We may not live through this night, but if we do, my daughter will meet you, and then you will understand. The fire popped violently, sending sparks into the air like fleeting stars. The drifter's mother whispered a prayer in the old tongue, words half lost to memory. And then, hoofbeats. They came slow at first, like a drumbeat in the distance. Then louder, closer, a dozen, maybe more. The cabin seemed to shrink with every step. The drifter chambered around. His mother reached for the small pistol she kept hidden in her sewing basket. The Apache woman drew a knife from her belt, its blade catching the firelight. The night was no longer silent. The night was war. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped. Men's voices drifted through the wind, gruff, laughing, unkind. One of them spat, the sound sharp against the frozen ground. Inside that cabin, a voice barked. Bring out the squaw, and we let the rest of you live. The drifter's grip tightened on his rifle. He looked at the Apache woman. She met his stare without flinching. This was no longer about choice. It was survival. And as the first outlaw pounded on the cabin door, the drifter finally understood. His life had been leading to this night. The night had settled heavy upon the frontier, darker than usual, as if the stars themselves refused to watch what was about to unfold. A restless wind crept through the canyons, carrying with it the sound of wolves howling in the distance. Inside the camp, however, silence reigned. No laughter, no music, not even the comfort of the usual campfire chatter. Everyone knew that tomorrow could change everything. The truce with the Apache was fragile, held together not by trust, but by a single thread of necessity. The rugged cowboy, his hand still marked with the faint stains of fruit juice from the strange encounter days earlier, sat staring into the fire. Across from him, the Apache woman, fierce, unbroken, yet carrying the weight of her people's survival, sharpened a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of steel scraping against stone cut through the silence like a warning. The cowboy's elderly mother, wrapped in a heavy shawl, rocked back and forth slightly. Her eyes, though clouded with age, seemed sharper than anyone else's. She had lived long enough to see men destroyed not by war itself, but by the choices they made when fear was louder than reason. She knew her son's soul was caught in a storm, torn between loyalty to his people and a strange, undeniable pull toward the Apache woman who had become more than just an enemy, more than just a stranger. "Son," she said finally, her voice cracked yet firm, "war isn't fought only with guns. Sometimes it's fought with the heart. And if you're not careful, your heart will betray you faster than any bullet." The cowboy didn't answer at first. His eyes followed the sparks that rose from the fire and disappeared into the void above. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but sometimes the heart is the only thing that keeps a man from becoming less than human." The Apache woman's eyes lifted for the first time, catching his. There was no smile, no warmth, but there was a flicker of something. Respect, maybe, or the recognition of a truth she had also felt but never spoken aloud. Before another word could pass between them, a distant echo thundered across the plains. Hooves. Many of them. The sound grew louder, closer, until the earth beneath them trembled. The camp sprang into action. Men grabbed rifles, women pulled children into the shadows, and the fire was smothered in haste. From the darkness, riders emerged. But these weren't Apaches. They weren't townsfolk either. They were outlaws, renegades who thrived in the chaos between cultures, feeding off blood and fear. Their leader, a towering figure with a scar carved across his cheek, raised a lantern high. His grin glowed like a knife in the night. "Well, well," he called, his voice dripping with venom. "What do we have here? Cowboys and redskins playin' nice together? Ain't that sweet? Shame it won't last." The renegades surrounded the camp. Their guns gleamed under the lantern light, cocked and ready. The truce that had taken so much to build was seconds away from being shattered, not by either side, but by men who thrived on destruction itself. The cowboy stood slowly, his hand hovering near his revolver. The Apache woman rose as well, blade in hand, her posture unyielding. For a moment, the unlikely pair stood side by side, enemies turned reluctant allies, facing a common threat. The outlaw leader dismounted, boots thudding against the dirt. He walked forward, eyes darting between the cowboy and the Apache woman. Then, with a cruel laugh, he said, "Funny thing about peace, it makes people soft. But don't worry. We'll fix that." He snapped his fingers. Instantly, two of his men dragged someone out from the shadows, a young Apache boy, barely old enough to hunt. His arms were bound, his face bruised, but his spirit was unbroken. He shouted something in his native tongue, a curse, a cry of defiance. The Apache woman's eyes widened, her blade trembling in her grip. She recognized him. He was her kin. The outlaw leader shoved the boy forward, letting him fall into the dirt. Then he pointed his gun at the boy's head. "Here's how this is gonna work. You folks keep playin' house together, or you walk away and let us do what we want. Either way, this kid ain't walkin' out unless I say so." The silence that followed was suffocating. The cowboy's jaw clenched, rage boiling beneath his calm exterior. His mother's hand found his arm, gripping it tightly. She didn't speak, but her touch carried a warning. One wrong move, and it would all be over. The Apache woman stepped forward, her voice cold and sharp as steel. "You want blood? Then take mine. But let the boy go." The outlaw leader tilted his head back and laughed. "Oh, I like you. Brave. Stupid, but brave. His gun shifted, now aimed at her instead. The boy screamed in protest, thrashing against his bonds. The cowboy's heart hammered in his chest. He had seconds to decide, seconds that would determine not just the boy's fate, but the future of every fragile bond forged in the fire of survival. And in that frozen moment, with the outlaws closing in, with his mother's grip on his arm and the Apache woman's defiance standing beside him, the cowboy knew the storm had arrived, and there would be no turning back. The wind swept across the prairie that night like an unseen ghost, carrying with it the scent of pine smoke and the distant echo of wolves. The campfire's glow painted harsh shadows across faces that were tired, but alert. The unlikely alliance, Weston, his weathered mother Eleanor, the proud Apache woman Naeli, and a handful of riders who had chosen to stay, sat together, knowing that the hours ahead would decide more than their own fates. Every creak of leather, every rustle in the grass carried weight. They had learned too much, seen too much, to dismiss fear as superstition. The name Colonel Briggs, once a symbol of security, was now whispered like a curse. His men were no longer soldiers but predators, sanctioned by greed. The land wasn't enough for them. They wanted dominance, obedience, and the erasure of anyone who refused to kneel. Weston's hand clenched tighter around the pouch of dried fruits he had carried since the day he first met Naeli. Once, it had been an innocent gesture, an offering across cultures. Now it felt like a talisman, a reminder that small choices could alter destinies. His mother's gaze, sharp and unwavering despite her age, caught his. "You can't hesitate any more," Eleanor said, her voice brittle yet iron-strong. "Men like Briggs thrive on hesitation. If you doubt, even for a breath, he'll take everything. He'll take her." Her eyes flicked toward Naeli, who sat apart, sharpening the edge of a knife. Firelight danced across her features, casting her in hues of bronze and shadow. She was beautiful, yes, but that beauty was not fragile. It was carved from survival, from generations who had endured storms far greater than the one now gathering. Naeli looked up, meeting Weston's gaze as though she had felt it burning against her skin. "Your mother is right," she said simply. "This is not only your fight, Weston. It is ours. My people know what it means to lose land, family, and history. If you ride away now, thinking you can escape, you will carry their screams in your sleep. Better to die standing than live haunted." The words landed like stone against his chest. Weston wanted to answer, but before he could, the lookout returned, breathless and pale. "They're moving," he hissed. "Briggs' men. 12, maybe more. They've lit torches, heading this way from the ridge." The silence that followed was deafening. Every man and woman in the circle felt the weight of choice pressing down. Run. Hide. Fight. Eleanor rose slowly, leaning on her cane, though her spine remained straight as a blade. "We fight," she declared, voice carrying like a sermon. "This land will not remember cowards." It was decided. The night became a blur of motion. Horses were tied at the ready, rifles loaded, blades checked. The plan was reckless, almost suicidal. They would ambush Briggs' men before dawn, striking from the shadows rather than waiting to be hunted like rabbits. The land itself would be their ally. The riverbank, the trees, the deep gullies that only locals knew how to navigate. Weston found himself beside Naeli as they prepared, the crackle of fire between them. For the first time, there was no barrier of culture, no lingering mistrust. Only two souls standing on the same precipice. "If I don't make it," Weston began, his throat tight, "promise me you'll—" Naeli cut him off with a sharp look. "Don't waste words on dying. Speak only of living." She pressed something into his hand. A small charm, woven from leather and beads. "For strength," she said. He stared at it, then at her. Something unspoken passed between them, heavier than any vow. Hours later, dawn bled across the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold. The prairie, usually so endless and free, now felt like a stage for tragedy. Weston crouched behind a fallen log, heart pounding as the torches appeared through the mist. Briggs' men moved like shadows, confident, arrogant, unaware they were walking into the jaws of resistance. Then, Eleanor's hand rose. For a heartbeat, Weston saw not an old woman, but a warrior mother, as fierce as any general. Her hand dropped. Gunfire split the air. Chaos erupted. Shouts, screams, the roar of rifles. Horses reared, blades clashed, smoke filled the morning sky. Weston fired until his rifle kicked against his shoulder, then drew steel, fighting not for survival alone but for something larger, for dignity, for freedom, for the right to choose their own lives. He caught sight of Briggs in the distance, mounted high, barking orders, a devil astride a black horse. Their eyes locked across the field. In that moment, Weston knew, this war was not about land or cattle. It was personal. It was destiny. The battle raged, and yet beneath the violence there was a rhythm, a story unfolding. Nayeli moved with the precision of a hawk, cutting down soldiers who underestimated her. Eleanor, impossibly, still stood at the rear lines, loading rifles with trembling but determined hands, shouting for the men to hold fast. But for every enemy that fell, two more rose. Briggs had numbers, discipline, and the cold ruthlessness of ambition. Weston felt the tide turning, felt despair gnaw at the edges of his resolve, until a voice cut through the smoke. Weston! It was Nayeli. She pointed toward the ridge. A chance. A weakness. If they could cut Briggs off, if they could corner him there, the battle might yet shift. Weston nodded, fire in his veins. He spurred forward, carving a path through chaos, his mother's words echoing, no hesitation. And so he rode, toward Briggs, toward fate, toward the reckoning that had been written since the first fruit had passed from one hand to another. The smoke of gunfire still clung to the prairie air, sharp and acrid, stinging my lungs with every breath. My hands shook from exertion and adrenaline, but there was no time to think about fatigue. Every second counted. Briggs was out there, orchestrating this massacre with the calm cruelty of a man who had never known defeat. Yet, as I ducked behind the charred remains of a fence post, I realized something that made my stomach knot tighter than any gunshot ever could. This wasn't just about cattle or land. This was about trust. And trust had been shattered long before the first bullet flew. I could see the ridge where the Apache scouts had set up. They were keeping the flank secure, but the majority of Briggs' men were moving with terrifying precision. Each step, each formation, betrayed not only military discipline but intelligence. This was no ragtag group of hired guns. This was a network of power, and I had stumbled directly into its gears. My heart sank, knowing the sheer scale of betrayal. The neighbors I had shared meals with, laughed with, swapped work duties with, they were gone. Their faces had vanished behind the masks of ambition and greed. I felt Eleanor's presence behind me, as unyielding as ever, loading her rifle with hands that were trembling but steady. "Weston," she hissed, "they've underestimated you. They think your fear will make you hesitate. It won't. Not now." Her eyes glimmered in the low light, fire in the midst of chaos. "We will survive this. We must." I swallowed hard and nodded, gripping my rifle with renewed focus. We moved in tandem, the horses navigating the scorched grass, their hooves sinking slightly into the churned earth. I caught sight of Nayeli slicing through Briggs' men, her movements almost otherworldly, grace, precision, and lethal intent. Each swing, each parry, left a mark, each strike pushing the enemy back a step closer to their own unraveling. She was a force of nature, the storm incarnate, and for a fleeting moment I felt a surge of hope. Then the rifle cracks pierced the air again. My horse stumbled, throwing me briefly, but instinct and training took over. I rolled to my feet, eyes scanning, heart hammering, and saw him. Briggs, atop a black stallion, the same calm expression as before, the embodiment of control. There was no emotion in his face, no hesitation, only cold calculation. It was then that I realized something horrifying. He had prepared for this exact moment. He had studied our movements, anticipated our defenses, and now he was executing a plan I hadn't even imagined. The thought hit me like a hammer. We were inside a trap within a trap. The battle unfolded like a storm breaking over the land. I moved with a desperate rhythm, firing when possible, ducking when necessary, praying for cover that seemed thinner with every passing second. Every fallen rider, every downed horse, became a grim reminder that death could be lurking anywhere. But amid this chaos, I noticed something. The insignias on Briggs' men, subtle markings on leather armbands, insignias that tied them to people I had trusted in the county council, to lawmen, to merchants. The betrayal went deeper than I had feared. It was a network, legal authority, commerce, even local government, and it had roots in every corner of this territory. I stumbled across a small grove of oak, nearly hidden, where a few survivors had taken cover. Among them was Jacob, one of the old ranch hands I thought had been loyal. His eyes were wide with fear, but when he saw me, there was a flicker of recognition, a spark of courage. "Weston," he shouted over the roar, "we can flank them from the east. Take the ridge." Hope flickered. We didn't have numbers, but we had knowledge of the land, and sometimes that was enough. The Apache scouts had already prepared traps, hidden pits and loose boulders, clever snares that could slow Briggs' men, maybe even turn the tide if executed perfectly. Every strategy one remembered from years of watching my father train me as a boy came rushing back. We moved. Silent, deliberate, each step measured. The ridge was close, but every inch brought the risk of discovery. The sun was rising higher, and with it, the world seemed almost beautiful, a cruel contrast to the hell unfolding around us. I focused on Briggs, the puppet master whose fingers seemed to control every strand of this nightmare. I had to reach him. He had to answer for every betrayal, every stolen life, every ruined family. When we finally crested the ridge, the full scale of Briggs' operation became horrifyingly clear. Horses, tents, stolen livestock, and men armed to the teeth sprawled across the valley. Yet there was a pattern, a flaw. They were spread too thin, overconfident in their own organization. That overconfidence would be their undoing. Eleanor, surprisingly agile for her age, led the first volley. Her rifle cracked, taking out a sentry with precision born of experience. Nayeli darted forward, silent and lethal, incapacitating a small group before they even knew she was there. I kept my rifle trained on the remaining men, my pulse synced with a rhythm of impending confrontation. And then I saw him again, Briggs. He had descended from his horse, calm, collected, surveying the chaos. For the first time, he looked almost human, and yet the malice in his eyes was undeniable. The moment our gazes met, I understood something. This was not a battle he had expected to lose. But fate, it seemed, had decided differently. The ridge became a battleground. Smoke, fire, and the cacophony of battle consumed every sense. But in that chaos, I felt a clarity I hadn't known before. Every betrayal, every stolen hour, every hidden snare of deception, it all pointed to this moment. Briggs would fall. His network would crumble. And justice, long delayed, would finally arrive. I spurred my horse forward, rushing toward him, feeling the weight of every wrong, every injustice, every life he had touched with cruelty. The final confrontation was near. The wind carried the acrid smoke, the scent of blood and gunpowder, and my heartbeat thundered with purpose. I knew that from here, there was no turning back. Victory demanded courage. Survival demanded cunning. And justice demanded every ounce of will I had left. The ridge was a precipice between life and annihilation, a jagged spine of earth where every decision carried consequences that would echo through the territory for years. The wind cut across my face, carrying the smoke and blood of battle, the metallic tang of horses' sweat and gunfire, and the subtle stench of betrayal that lingered heavier than anything else. I could see Briggs now, towering over his operation like a dark sentinel, calm, his eyes scanning the chaos as if he were untouchable. But I had learned something in the last hours. He was not infallible. Eleanor and Niele had regrouped at my side, their expressions a mixture of grim determination and exhaustion. Our combined forces were small, but we had knowledge, precision, and the element of surprise on our side. Every man and woman in Briggs' army had been trained to follow orders, to respond in predictable ways. We were unpredictable. We were a force not of muscle, but of instinct and intimate knowledge of the land. I signaled to Jacob, who crouched behind a boulder near the ridge. "East flank," I whispered. "Take the path through the brush. Surprise them from behind. Don't fire until you see the mark." His nod was subtle, almost invisible, but it was enough. The plan was risky. Too risky for anyone else. But desperation, I realized, sharpened the mind. Fear, instead of paralyzing, became fuel. I could see it in Eleanor, the steadying of her hands, the intensity of her gaze. And Niele, every movement fluid, deadly, controlled. She was poetry in motion, a silent storm cutting through the ranks of our enemy. We descended the ridge carefully, using rocks, gullies, and shadows to cover our approach. Briggs' men were spread thin, overconfident in the fortress of tents and stolen livestock below. Their arrogance was palpable, almost tangible, a miscalculation that would cost them dearly. Every glance they spared, every laugh and careless gesture, was a crack in their armor. The first engagement was sudden. Niele struck from the shadows, her blades flashing with lethal precision. Men fell silently, cut down before they could sound an alarm. I fired from behind cover, careful, deliberate, each shot counting. Chaos erupted in the valley below, but it was a controlled chaos, the kind that favored the prepared and the cunning. And then I saw him, Briggs. He had mounted his black stallion again, riding calmly into the center of the fray. His confidence had not waned, his presence radiated authority, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a recognition that the tide might not be entirely in his favor. My pulse quickened. Every step he took, every command he shouted, tightened the noose he had created around himself. Eleanor and I coordinated silently, our movements almost instinctual. She drew attention, firing, forcing the enemy to respond to her presence, while I circled around the edge of the ridge, moving closer to Briggs. Every horse, every fallen rider, every shout was another layer of the intricate puzzle I had to solve in real time. The weight of responsibility pressed on my shoulders like the heaviest saddle I had ever carried. One wrong move, one missed step, and it would all collapse, not just for me, but for every innocent family caught in Briggs' scheme. The smoke cleared briefly, and I caught a glimpse of the ledger he clutched in his hand, the same ledger I had seen him reference earlier, filled with names, dates, and records of stolen livestock. It was proof, but it was also leverage, a weapon he would use to buy himself time. I had to act, and act fast. I sprinted along a narrow ridge path, my boots sliding against loose gravel, my rifle ready, every sense alive. The enemy's formation was breaking, confusion spreading like wildfire, but Briggs remained a beacon of control amid the chaos. I needed to reach him before he could escape, before he could rally his men or destroy the evidence. Suddenly, a sharp crack behind me, the sound of a rifle. My horse stumbled, throwing me to the ground. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I rolled, covered, and pressed on. The path was narrow, but the ridge offered natural cover. I moved with desperation, each step a gamble, each breath a battle against exhaustion and fear. Then I saw it, the moment of opportunity. Briggs had dismounted to confront a small group of my allies who had flanked his eastern line. He was momentarily vulnerable, distracted by the unexpected attack. My rifle raised, finger tight against the trigger, and for the first time in hours, I felt a sharp clarity. This was it. The culmination of every betrayal, every stolen herd, every injustice. The shot rang out, echoing across the valley. Briggs fell, and a ripple of disbelief spread among his men. Panic replaced discipline. The ledger slipped from his hands, landing just out of reach but still within sight. Eleanor and Nieli pressed the advantage, driving the remaining men into retreat, forcing them to abandon their stolen livestock, forcing the corrupt network to unravel before my eyes. As Briggs' men scattered, the reality of the moment settled over me. The betrayal, the conspiracy, the years of calculated theft and intimidation. It was ending. The ridge, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a vantage point of triumph. Yet even in victory, I knew this was not the end. Justice required more than a rifle shot. It required exposure, evidence, and the involvement of forces that Briggs and his network could not control. I retrieved the ledger, cradling it like a fragile lifeline. Names, dates, connections. It was everything we needed to dismantle the operation legally and irrevocably. But even as I did, I felt the weight of loss. The land had been scarred, trust shattered, and countless lives affected by the greed and ambition of men like Briggs. There was no undoing the suffering, only rectifying it where possible. I turned to Eleanor and Nieli, their faces streaked with soot and blood, but burning with the same resolve I felt. "It's not over," I said, voice hoarse but steady. "We make this right. For everyone. Every family. Every rancher. Every innocent life this corruption touched." We moved carefully through the valley, securing the remaining livestock, rounding up the fleeing men, and preparing to contact the authorities. The operation had been exposed, but the final reckoning was just beginning. I knew federal involvement was necessary. The scale of the conspiracy demanded it. And with the ledger in our possession, proof could no longer be hidden or ignored. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the valley in harsh clarity, I realized the full extent of what had happened. We had survived, yes, but survival alone was not enough. Justice, truth, and the restoration of order would take longer, harder work than any of us had imagined. Yet standing there, amidst the chaos and the beginning of recovery, I felt a rare sense of hope. Briggs' empire was crumbling, and the people he had betrayed had a chance to reclaim their lives. But I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. The battle had changed me. The land, the betrayal, the sheer scale of human greed. I had faced it all, and I had survived. And now, with the ledger in hand and the corruption exposed, I had the means to ensure that justice would prevail, even if it required every ounce of courage I possessed. The ledger in my hands felt heavier than any rifle, heavier than any burden I had carried across these hills. Every name, every transaction, every calculated theft and conspiracy, it was a roadmap to the full extent of the corruption. I knew that if I delivered this to the right people, the organization that had haunted this territory for years would finally face justice. Federal marshals arrived within hours, their presence immediate and overwhelming. Davis and his team, long observing from afar, descended into the valley with precision. Horses clattered over the rocks and dirt, badges gleaming under the harsh afternoon sun. The conspirators who hadn't fled were quickly restrained, the ledger serving as incontrovertible evidence. Even the sheriff and Judge Briggs, men whose positions had allowed them to manipulate the law for years, were taken into custody. The realization hit me hard. The very people entrusted to protect the community had been integral to its destruction. I watched as trucks loaded with the recovered livestock rumbled down the valley, families reclaiming what had been stolen from them. There was a weight lifted from the land itself, a tangible relief in the air. Yet beneath the relief, there remained scars that no amount of restitution could completely erase. I could only hope that rebuilding trust and security would follow as efficiently as the federal operation had dismantled the network. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the valley in golden hues, I stood atop the ridge where it had all begun. My herd grazed peacefully below, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure. The betrayal, the fear, the near-constant tension, it was behind me. But the lesson was indelible. Vigilance, courage, and the willingness to confront evil head-on were the true measures of survival in a land where trust could be weaponized. The morning air was crisp, almost sharp, as I rode across the fields I had feared were lost forever. The sun had barely crested the hills, painting the dew-soaked grass in hues of gold and silver. My herd, once scattered and stolen, now grazed calmly, their movements steady, their presence a testament to survival and reclamation. The chaos that had plagued these lands, the betrayal, the theft, the constant shadow of danger, felt distant but never forgotten. Every hoofbeat beneath me reminded me of the precarious balance between trust and vigilance. Federal marshals had stayed for weeks, securing the remaining conspirators, confiscating their ill-gotten gains, and restoring legal oversight to a territory that had been run by fear disguised as law. W. D. Langston and Curtis Valentine faced life sentences, their meticulously planned operations reduced to fragments of paper in evidence boxes. Ezekiel Marsh and the other conspirators were held accountable for decades of theft and conspiracy. Judge Briggs and Sheriff Morrison, symbols of corruption, were removed from positions of power, their influence eradicated. It was a thorough, uncompromising justice, one that restored not only the stolen livestock but also the fragile trust within our community. As I walked the repaired fences, inspecting the posts and gates, I reflected on how much had changed. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, the air lighter, and even the wind carried a whisper of relief. But the human element, the lesson learned about the duality of those we trust, remained indelible. I had learned that evil often wears familiar faces, that courage is measured not just by the battles we fight, but by the patience and wisdom we summon to confront deceit. I had faced betrayal from neighbors, oversight from authorities, and the constant threat of death, yet I had endured. And through endurance came victory, not merely over criminals, but over fear itself. Families who had lost everything began returning, rebuilding homes and herds, supported by restitution and a renewed sense of justice. The land, once a place of hidden treachery, had become a sanctuary again, a place where hard work, vigilance, and integrity could flourish. I no longer trusted blindly, but I did trust the law, the community, and the enduring truth that justice, though sometimes delayed, would arrive. Riding toward the ridge where I had first discovered the missing goats, I paused to watch the sun rise fully, illuminating the valley in its glory. My herd was safe, my land secure, and the future, for the first time in months, belonged entirely to me. Every struggle, every shadow of doubt, every confrontation had led to this moment, a reclamation of life, land, and honor. And in that still, golden light, I realized that sometimes the cost of vigilance and courage was steep, but the reward, the right to protect what you hold dear, was priceless.